In a quiet Iowa town, a man known for his kindness, his loyalty, and his deep love for his family is found lifeless in the place he felt safest, his own home. Within hours, the perfect image of a marriage begins to crack. What begins as a tragedy quickly turns into a mystery. Investigators uncover a string of private messages hidden from the outside world. Two people no one in this community would have suspected become the focus of the investigation. And as the story unfolds, friends will be divided, families tested, and a small Iowa town will never be the same again. This is the story of Ryan Cooper and the secrets that changed everything. Before we begin, a reminder. This story is told with respect for everyone affected. We will focus on the facts, the investigation, and the human stories behind them, avoiding unnecessary speculation or detail that does not serve the truth. This is True Crime Whispers, where we explore real cases with care, depth, and empathy. In the next few hours, we'll walk through Ryan Cooper's life, from his childhood in rural Iowa to his marriage, his friendships, and the life he built. We'll learn about Karina Cooper, the woman he loved, and the man whose unexpected connection to her would change everything, Huston Danker. We will follow the investigation from the first moments at the Cooper home to the courtroom where a jury would hear every detail and decide the fate of those accused. And as the way, we'll uncover moments of friendship, moments of betrayal, and the digital evidence that would become the heart of this case. This is not just a story about a crime. It is a story about people, their choices, their connections, and the lasting mark they leave behind. So let's begin with Ryan Cooper's story, long before June 18, 2021. Before we can understand the events of that June morning, we have to understand Ryan Cooper, not as a name in a headline, but as a person, a son, a friend, a husband, someone whose story began long before the world would ever hear about him in a courtroom. Ryan Cooper was born and raised in the heart of Iowa. He grew up in a close-knit family that valued hard work, honesty, and looking out for one another. His parents were the kind of people who believed in doing the right thing, not because someone was watching, but because it was who they were. From an early age, Ryan stood out for his kindness. Teachers remembered him as the student who noticed when someone was sitting alone, and who would quietly take the seat next to them. His friends say he wasn't loud or attention-seeking, but when he spoke, people listened. There was a sincerity to his words that stayed with you. In school, Ryan discovered a love for sports, not because he wanted trophies, but because he enjoyed being part of a team. Baseball was his favorite. It wasn't uncommon for him to spend hours practicing his swing in the backyard or helping younger kids in the neighborhood learn the basics of the game. His parents instilled in him a strong work ethic. Summers often meant helping out with chores, mowing lawns for neighbors, or picking up part-time jobs. Those early lessons in responsibility stayed with him well into adulthood. By the time he graduated high school, Ryan had earned a reputation for being dependable. If he told you he would be there, he would be there, whether it was for a 6 a.m. shift or a friend who needed help moving furniture. Reliability wasn't just something he offered, it was part of who he was. After school, Ryan explored different career paths, eventually finding steady work that allowed him to stay close to home. Staying near his roots mattered to him. He didn't just live in a small Iowa community, he was part of it. He greeted people by name, checked in on elderly neighbors, and supported local events. It was during this period of his life that Ryan met Karina. Friends recall that meeting her lit up a new kind of energy in him. He talked about her often, about her laugh, her drive, and how quickly they seemed to connect. They began dating, and before long, those close to him could see that he was serious about building a future together. Their wedding was a community event, not in size, but in spirit. People described it as warm and genuine, a reflection of the couple themselves. Ryan, in his vows, spoke of commitment, of always choosing each other, no matter what life brought their way. As the years passed, Ryan and Karina settled into married life. They built a home, shared routines, and made time for trips when they could. To outsiders, it appeared steady, the kind of relationship people assumed would last. Ryan's friendships remained a cornerstone of his life. He had a small but loyal circle, the kind of friends who could pick up right where they left off, no matter how much time had passed. They would describe him as someone who would never judge you for your mistakes, but would also never hesitate to tell you the truth when you needed to hear it. In many ways, Ryan's story could have been anyone's, an ordinary man leading an ordinary life. And yet, for those who knew him, he was anything but ordinary. His consistency, his quiet strength, and his deep loyalty made him someone people counted on, which is why, when tragedy struck, it shook the community to its core. To truly understand what happened later, we have to remember Ryan not just as a figure in a case file, but as a whole person, a man who worked hard, loved deeply, and believed in the people he let into his life.
His Ryan Cooper's life was marked by steadiness and quiet reliability. Karina's was defined by movement, ambition, and a constant need for connection. Understanding her journey, from her earliest years to the choices she made as an adult, is essential to understanding how the events in this story unfolded. Karina grew up in Iowa, though her early life was shaped by more change than Ryan ever experienced. Her parents worked hard to provide for their children, but life was not without its challenges. She often spoke about wanting more than what was around her, not in a way that rejected her roots, but in a way that suggested she was always looking ahead. In school, Karina was known for her energy. Friends recall her being talkative, quick to make connections, and eager to be involved in whatever was happening. She was not the type to fade into the background. If something caught her interest, she went after it. Her parents encouraged her to work hard, and by her teenage years, Karina was already thinking about a career. She was drawn to the beauty industry, a world that combined creativity with interaction. She enjoyed making people feel confident and heard, and she often dreamed aloud about running her own salon someday. After finishing school, she began working in local salons, building a reputation for being personable and attentive with clients. She remembered details about their lives, asked about their families, and sent quick messages to check in, the kind of small gestures that made people feel valued. It was through her work and through the web of connections that small towns inevitably create that Karina eventually crossed paths with Ryan Cooper. He was quieter than most people she met, but that seemed to draw her in. Friends of the couple recall how she described him in the early days: dependable, grounded, someone she could picture a future with. Their relationship moved steadily. They dated, met each other's families, and soon marriage was on the horizon. On their wedding day, Karina was radiant, smiling in nearly every photograph. The vows they exchanged promised commitment and partnership, the same values Ryan had been raised with and which Karina seemed ready to embrace. The early years of their marriage were, by most accounts, happy. They built a home together, created routines, and celebrated milestones with friends and family. Yet those who knew Karina say she still had a restless streak, a desire for excitement and novelty that sometimes clashed with the steady rhythm of Ryan's world. Karina maintained an active social life, both in person and online. She enjoyed documenting moments, sharing updates, and keeping in touch with friends from all stages of her life. Her phone was rarely out of reach, a detail that would later take on new significance in the investigation. Through her salon work, she met many people, clients who became friends, friends who became confidants. One of those connections was Huston Danker. At first, their interactions seemed typical for a stylist and client, but over time, the conversations became more personal. What began as friendly rapport slowly shifted into a bond that extended beyond the salon chair. Friends later said they noticed Karina and Huston's growing closeness. It wasn't necessarily obvious to everyone at first, but in hindsight, some remembered subtle signs, longer conversations, more frequent meetups, and the unmistakable connection that forms when two people share a secret understanding. Still, to most of the community, Karina's identity was that of Ryan's wife, a local stylist, friendly neighbor, and active presence in the town. She attended events, posted photos, and maintained the outward image of a settled life. Whatever thoughts or feelings existed beneath that surface, they remained unseen by most. But as time went on, the space between the life Karina presented and the reality she was living began to widen. Private conversations grew more frequent, messages became more coded, and soon those moments of separation from Ryan's world would set the stage for decisions that could not be undone. By the summer of 2021, two names were familiar to nearly everyone in Ryan and Karina Cooper's lives. The first, of course, was Ryan himself. The second was Huston Danker, a man whose path to that moment was as ordinary as it was complicated. And though few could have predicted it at the time, his presence in this story would become impossible to ignore. Huston grew up in Iowa, not far from where Ryan and Karina lived. His early life was shaped by the same hallmarks of small-town living: neighbors who knew your name, schools where everyone recognized each other, and the feeling that your reputation could follow you for years. His parents raised him with an emphasis on self-reliance. They encouraged him to work hard, but also to think for himself, to ask questions, to challenge ideas, and to be confident in the choices he made. In school, Huston was athletic and outgoing. He played sports, participated in group activities, and built a network of friends that extended well beyond his classmates. Those who knew him described him as someone who could make conversation with just about anyone. After high school, Huston explored various job opportunities, eventually finding steady work that allowed him to remain in the area. He valued his independence, but he also maintained a wide circle of acquaintances. To most, he was simply a familiar face, someone you'd greet in passing, perhaps stop and talk to if you had the time. Huston had an easy charm. Conversations with him often felt relaxed, casual. He remembered details, asked follow-up questions, and could make people feel like they were the only person in the room. That skill served him well in forming connections, both professional and personal. It was through this social ease that Huston eventually met Karina Cooper. Their introduction came through the world of her salon, an environment built on conversation and connection. At first, their exchanges were no different than any stylist and client interaction. Light banter, friendly updates, and the kind of small talk that fills an appointment. But over time, the topics broadened. They began discussing more personal matters, daily frustrations, small victories, and shared observations about life in a small town. For Karina, who thrived on connection, these moments may have felt refreshing. For Huston, they seemed to offer an easy companionship. In small communities, relationships often overlap. Friends of friends become regular fixtures in your life. Huston's presence became more familiar to Karina, and by extension, more known to those around her. Yet for most people, there was nothing unusual about their connection, at least not in the beginning. Friends later recalled moments that, in hindsight, took on new meaning. A longer pause in conversation, an inside joke shared between the two, or a glance that seemed to say more than words. Still, these were subtleties, the kind of details you might only notice if you were looking for them. Huston's life outside of this connection continued much as it had before. He worked, spent time with friends, and maintained a presence in the community. Yet as months passed, the conversations between Huston and Karina became more frequent, more private, and eventually more central to both of their lives than anyone could have anticipated. Whether those around them sensed the shift or not, the reality was that Huston Danker's name, once just another in a long list of acquaintances, would soon be spoken in connection to one of the most shocking investigations this small Iowa town had ever faced. And as we move forward in this story, his role will become clearer, not just in how events unfolded, but in how they were interpreted, challenged, and ultimately judged. By the start of 2021, Ryan and Karina Cooper's marriage looked much the same as it had for years to those on the outside. A home in a quiet Iowa neighborhood, two people with busy schedules, and the steady rhythm of small-town life. But behind closed doors, subtle changes had begun to take shape. And though small at first, they would slowly alter the course of their lives. Ryan noticed them before anyone else. At first, it was small differences, a late return home without much explanation, a phone that was always face down on the table, a shift in tone during conversations that once flowed easily. He didn't jump to conclusions, that wasn't his nature, but the feeling was there, something was changing. Karina, for her part, seemed busier than ever. She spent more time at the salon, more evenings out with friends, and was more active on her phone. She still engaged with Ryan, still participated in the routines they'd built, but moments of quiet between them became more frequent. The truth, as it would later be revealed, was that her friendship with Huston Danker was deepening. What began as casual conversation during salon appointments had moved into the realm of private messaging. Platforms like Snapchat became their primary channel, the kind of communication where messages disappear after being read, leaving little behind.
To friends, their interactions didn't raise immediate alarms. In a small town, it's not unusual for people to maintain overlapping friendships. But in hindsight, those who knew them recall how the two seemed to seek each other out, finding time for conversations, both in person and digitally, that didn't include anyone else. By late spring, the shift in energy around Karina and Huston had grown. More frequent meetups, more private exchanges. And while nothing was publicly declared, the undercurrent was there. Ryan felt it. A few close friends noticed it. But life in a close-knit town often teaches people to keep their observations to themselves. Technology would later become the key to understanding this period. Investigators would recover location data, message records, and activity logs that painted a fuller picture of the weeks leading up to June 18. Patterns emerged, times and locations that connected Karina and Huston in ways that contradicted the version of events they initially shared. Ryan, still the man who valued honesty and directness, was unlikely to ignore these feelings forever. While we cannot know the exact conversations between him and Karina during these weeks, friends believe he may have asked questions, searching for reassurance, for clarity, for the truth. At the same time, Huston's role in Karina's life was shifting from occasional presence to consistent contact. This wasn't just someone she ran into from time to time. It was someone she spoke to daily, often late at night. Digital records would later confirm this, showing message exchanges in the early morning hours well outside the bounds of typical friendship. The weeks before June 18th carried no single explosive moment, no obvious confrontation or event that signaled what was to come. Instead, it was a slow build, a layering of small decisions, choices made in private that, together, created the conditions for tragedy. In stories like this, there is often a temptation to look for one clear turning point, a day when everything changed.
But in the Cooper case, it was more like a tide coming in, each wave subtle on its own, until suddenly the shoreline was unrecognizable. For Ryan, life continued much as before, working, keeping up with friends, maintaining the home. But for Karina and Huston, the connection they had built was no longer just background noise. It was a central thread in their days, a constant undercurrent that would eventually pull them both into the center of an investigation neither could have imagined. And so by the time June 18th arrived, all of the pieces were in place, even if most of the people around them didn't yet know it. A man with questions, a woman with divided loyalties, a friend whose role had shifted into something more. The calm before a storm that no one in the small Iowa community could see until it was too late. Friday, June 18, 2021, began like so many summer mornings in Iowa. Quiet streets, the hum of early commuters, and the soft golden light of the sun rising over endless fields. For Ryan Cooper, it was another day in a familiar routine. He had no way of knowing that within hours, this day would become the defining moment of his life story and the last page in it. In the Cooper household, the morning likely began as it always did, coffee brewing, phones lighting up with new notifications, and the sound of footsteps moving between the kitchen and the living room. These were the kinds of mornings Ryan valued, simple, predictable, and grounded in the life he had worked to build. Karina's day also began early. She had salon appointments scheduled, and, as always, her phone remained close at hand. Friends would later recall how she was active online that morning, sending quick messages and checking in on conversations that had been ongoing for days. By mid-morning, life in town was in full motion, delivery trucks unloading, kids riding bikes, and regulars filing into the local coffee shop. To the outside world, it was an ordinary Friday. But in the background, digital exchanges between Karina and Huston continued. Some were light and casual. Others carried an urgency that, in hindsight, would seem like the build-up to something larger. Ryan spent the late morning tending to tasks around the house and running errands. He was a man who liked to keep things in order: his home, his schedule, his responsibilities. Friends say that if something needed doing, he wouldn't let it sit for long. As noon approached, Karina's activities shifted. Whether in the salon or between appointments, she was once again in communication with Huston. Investigators would later note that their messaging during this period was frequent, brief exchanges, often separated by just a few minutes. The afternoon brought the heat of an Iowa summer. The streets slowed. People retreated indoors or sought shade where they could find it. But inside the Cooper home, there was a different kind of tension. Though we may never know exactly what was said in those final hours, we do know that Ryan and Karina were both present there, and that something shifted between them. At some point in the afternoon, the ordinary pace of the day broke. Investigators would later piece together timelines from phone data, vehicle sightings, and witness statements. These details painted a picture that was far from ordinary, one that suggested movement, contact, and decisions being made in real time. By early evening, the town was settling into its weekend rhythm. Families gathered for dinner. Neighbors mowed the lawns before the sunset. But for Ryan, Karina, and Huston, the events of the day had reached a point of no return. In the hours that followed, an irreversible line would be crossed. The precise sequence of those final moments is known only through investigative findings. What we can say, without speculation, is that by the time the evening light faded, Ryan Cooper's life was cut short. And within minutes, the focus shifted from whatever had just occurred inside that home to the first steps of a police investigation that would span months. What makes this case so haunting isn't just the loss itself, but how quickly the ordinary can become unrecognizable. That morning, it was coffee, errands, and phone calls. By nightfall, it was flashing lights, crime scene tape, and questions no one could yet answer. And so the quiet Iowa town that had started its day with the hum of routine would end it with whispers, phone calls, and a story that was just beginning to unfold. The investigation into what happened on June 18th had only begun, and it would lead to revelations no one saw coming. When the first officers arrived at the Cooper home on the evening of June 18, 2021, the air was still warm, but the atmosphere had shifted. What had been a quiet residential street just hours earlier was now a point of intense focus. Neighbors stood at a distance, watching in uneasy silence as law enforcement began their work. Initial reports were brief and urgent. A man was unresponsive inside. Emergency medical personnel entered quickly, their equipment in hand. Within minutes, it became clear that there would be no trip to the hospital, no chance for recovery. Ryan Cooper was gone. The home was secured as a possible crime scene. Officers moved with deliberate care, documenting the layout, noting any items out of place, and photographing each room before anything could be touched. It was the first step in a process that would stretch for months. Karina Cooper was present when law enforcement arrived. She provided initial statements, explaining her account of the day, her timeline, and her version of the final moments before Ryan's death. Officers listened, took notes, and asked clarifying questions. But as with any investigation, early information is just a starting point. Neighbors were approached for interviews. Some had seen nothing unusual. Others recalled small details. A car parked where it usually wasn't, voices carrying from inside the Cooper home, and a sudden quiet that felt different. Each account was logged and cross-referenced against the timeline. Detectives soon turned to digital evidence, phones, computers, and online accounts. In the modern age, communication leaves trails, even when people believe they've been careful. Karina's phone was collected, as was Ryan's. Data extraction tools began pulling records of calls, texts, and activity usage. Almost immediately, one detail caught investigators' attention. Frequent communication between Karina and Huston Danker in the days, weeks, and hours leading up to June 18. Some messages were casual, others appeared to be more personal. Many had been sent using platforms where messages disappear after being read, which raised questions.
Houston was contacted for an interview. Like Karina, he shared his version of events, describing his movements that day and his relationship with her. But timelines have a way of revealing inconsistencies, and as detectives compared his statements to the digital records, subtle discrepancies began to surface. The investigation also examined location data from phones and vehicles. Patterns emerged, locations where Karina and Houston had both been, sometimes within minutes of each other, and times that contradicted what they had initially told police. Forensic teams combed through the Cooper home for physical evidence. Items were collected for testing, fibers, fingerprints, and anything that might hold DNA. Each piece was photographed, labeled, and sent to the lab. Results would take time, but every sample had the potential to either support or challenge the developing theory of the case. Meanwhile, detectives continued building their picture of Ryan's final day. They reconstructed the hours before his death, lining up what witnesses said, what the digital trail showed, and what physical evidence suggested. Slowly, a more complete narrative began to take shape, one that pointed toward deliberate actions rather than random chance. The moment suspicion solidified was not a single dramatic breakthrough, but the accumulation of dozens of smaller details. A text message sent at a specific time,
a vehicle seen on a nearby camera, a piece of evidence that contradicted an earlier statement. Each thread pulled carefully led back to the same two people. By late summer, the investigation had reached its turning point. Detectives believed they had enough to move forward. Arrest warrants were drawn up, and in a coordinated effort, law enforcement took Karina Cooper and Huston Danker into custody. The community that had been watching from a distance for weeks now saw the case break wide open. The charges, the courtroom appearances, and the unfolding legal process would dominate local headlines for months. But for investigators, their focus remained the same: to ensure that the story of what happened to Ryan Cooper was told in full, supported by evidence that could withstand the weight of trial. In the end, the investigation into Ryan's death was as much about patience as it was about persistence. Piece by piece, the truth had been assembled, not from a single clue, but from the careful alignment of many. And as the legal process began, those pieces would now be placed before a jury. By July 2025, more than 4 years had passed since the death of Ryan Cooper. In that time, the investigation had evolved into a full criminal case. Charges had been filed, and the legal process had moved slowly but deliberately toward trial. Now the day had arrived. Karina Cooper would stand before a jury to answer for the events of June 18, 2021. The courthouse steps were lined with reporters, local residents, and members of both families. Cameras clicked as Karina arrived, escorted by her legal team, expression unreadable. Inside, the courtroom was filled to a capacity. Rows of wooden benches occupied by friends, relatives, and curious onlookers who had followed the case from the beginning. The trial began with opening statements. The prosecution painted a picture of a marriage in decline, a hidden relationship between Karina and Huston Danker, and a deliberate plan that ended in Ryan's death. They promised the jury they would hear from witnesses, see digital evidence, and understand why this was no accident but a calculated act. The defense countered with a very different story. They acknowledged the strain in the marriage, but argued that the prosecution's theory relied too heavily on assumptions about motive. They suggested the possibility of another suspect, raising questions about whether the investigation had been too narrowly focused on Karina from the start. Over the following days, key witnesses took the stand. Friends of Ryan testified about his character, describing him as loyal, hard-working, and devoted to those he cared about. Neighbors recounted the night of June 18th, sharing what they had heard and seen. Digital forensic experts walked the jury through recovered messages and location data, showing patterns of communication between Karina and Huston in the hours leading up to Ryan's death. One of the most dramatic moments came when investigators described the physical evidence from the Cooper home, the timeline of events, the inconsistencies in Karina's statements, and how those details fit together. The jury listened intently, many taking notes. The defense pressed back during cross-examination, challenging the reliability of certain witness recollections and questioning whether some of the digital evidence could be interpreted differently. They continued to raise the theory of an alternate suspect, though they provided no direct evidence to support it. After nearly 2 weeks of testimony, the trial reached its closing arguments. The prosecution stood before the jury one final time, urging them to focus on the evidence, the messages, the movements, and the choices that led to Ryan's death. They told the jury this was a case of betrayal, premeditation, and a decision that could never be undone. The defense, in their final words, reminded the jury that the burden of proof was on the state. They argued that unanswered questions and alternate explanations meant there was reasonable doubt. They asked the jury to consider whether the case presented by the prosecution truly eliminated every other possibility.
The jury deliberated for several hours before returning with their decision. As the verdict was read, guilty of first-degree murder, the courtroom was silent except for the clerk's voice. Karina Cooper showed little visible reaction. Across the room, members of Ryan's family held each other, their relief tempered by the weight of the moment. The judge set sentencing for September 5, 2025. Until then, Karina would remain in custody. Outside the courthouse, reporters delivered live updates, while supporters and critics of the verdict shared their reactions. Meanwhile, the case against Huston Danker was set to move forward. His trial was scheduled for August 2025, and prosecutors made it clear they intended to present much of the same evidence, connecting his actions to the events of June 18th. In the days after the verdict, Ryan's family spoke publicly, expressing gratitude to the investigators, the jury, and the community members who had supported them. Their statements were filled with both sorrow and relief. Sorrow for the years of loss, relief that accountability had been reached. The community reflected on the case as well. Some saw it as a reminder of how fragile relationships can be and how quickly a sense of safety can be shattered. Others found themselves unsettled by the unanswered questions, the parts of the story that may never be fully explained. Ryan Cooper's story will always be more than the events of that June day. It is a story about trust, about choices, and about the ripple effects that extend far beyond a single moment. And for those who knew him, it will forever be about the person he was, the friend, the family member, the man whose absence is still deeply felt. Before we close, there's one more question that remains. And it's not for the courts, the investigators, or the headlines. It's for you. Do you believe the full truth has come out? Or are there still pieces missing from this puzzle? If this story has found its way to you, it's because you've already started looking beyond the surface. You've already begun escaping the simple narratives, searching for the deeper layers where truth lives. That search matters. Subscribe, because they're watching who unsubscribes, and every person who stays is another set of eyes refusing to look away. Share your respectful thoughts below. What do you see in this case that others might have missed? And join us for more in-depth stories where we follow the evidence, listen with care, and seek truth without rushing past the human cost. Because some stories aren't just headlines, they're warnings.